Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's called oyster gardening, and it's a way to revitalize the waterways. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. You might see them off the bulkhead of someone's waterfront property. They're about 2 feet by 3 feet of piping with a cage sunk into the water to grow the little critters. And they're being promoted by the Delaware Center for Inland Bays to keep the state's waterways clean. In our studio this morning, Bob Collins, he's a program manager for the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays, and Ream, he's a volunteer with the center and is a participant in the oyster gardening program. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me start with you, Bob. So, how did this program about gardening oysters get started? What's the history here?
Well, the program goes back to 2003. And it really started out as an experiment to see if oysters would grow in some of the backwaters, if you will, of the inland bays, the South Bethany dead end lagoons and such. It turns out that oysters do grow, and they grow well. They don't grow well enough, and the waters aren't clean enough in those areas to eat, but you can grow them to good size, and the oysters are an important species. They help clean the water.
So, what prompted this program?
Well, it was before I started, so I don't.
Some sense about it, yeah.
I can't talk about exactly what the all the particulars about how it started, but it, with cooperation from University of Delaware, their Sea Grant program, and also Delaware State University, partnered with the Center for Inland Bays, my employer, to come up with this program.
So, describe for us a little bit about the significance of the oyster, particularly in keeping the various bays and waterways clean. How does that work?
Well, oysters filter the water. They suck in water and filter out mainly phytoplankton, and by doing so, they sequester nitrogen and phosphorus, which are two primary pollutants in the inland bays, take it out of the water column, store it in their body tissue in a type of waste that they generate called pseudofeces, and that takes it out of the water column, and it actually helps clean the water. In addition, oysters have are what's known as a keystone species, and what that is it's they'll promote other beneficial organisms that will grow around them. Delaware State student documented, I believe it was 49 species that live in and around the oyster cages. And when you pull up an oyster cage, when an oyster gardener pulls it up to clean it out, you'll often see fish, crabs, eels, a number of things that are beneficial.
So, in terms of the inland waterways, I know, for instance, the Chesapeake Bay, and we've talked a lot about this, but the oyster being significant in terms of trying to keep the bay clean. I mean, one time there were so many oysters. I mean, it was like almost every day that they would circulate. Obviously, it's much less now. How important has that oyster been in keeping the waterways up there where you guys are?
Well, it's the same idea. Of course, the Chesapeake Bay is considerably larger than the inland bays, but still, it's a marine, an estuary, and we suffer many of the same problems that the Chesapeake suffers. Again, the scale's a lot different.
And also, there's we said don't chuck your shucks. What's that about, by the way? Before we get into how to do all this.
Well, Don't Chuck Your Shucks is our oyster shell recycling program.
Right.
And what we've done is we've partnered with restaurants in our watershed. And what we do is we go collect their oyster shells. They separate them out of their waste stream, put them in a separate bin, We have a guy that goes around during the summer. He goes around twice a week, collects them. We store the oyster shells, cure them so that all the tartar sauce and cocktail sauce and those type of things kind of get composted out, if you will. And then we use the oyster shells for restoration purposes. One of the ways that we use them is we put them in a bag, and it's really a building block that we would use for other, for various projects. Ab helped us a lot on that. He developed the bagging process. So what we'll do is we'll go to groups. We'll have groups of about 15 people is about the ideal number.
Yeah.
And they'll come in, spend 2 hours in a semi-automated process, and put the oysters, the cured oysters, into these bags so that we can take them out and put them in various projects, whether it's living shoreline. We'll be using them in oyster gardening, that type of thing.
Ab, I want to turn to you. So how did you get involved with this? You're a volunteer here, and you, I guess, do a little oyster gardening. What's the story behind you?
Well, I moved down here about 3 years ago. I retired and decided to get out of the rat race. And about 2 years ago, I read an article about the Center for Inland Bays, and they were calling for volunteers, and they told a little bit about what they're doing. And I've been looking for some way to get involved locally, and I really believed in what these guys do. They're out to help try to preserve and protect, restore the bays, and so I signed up as a volunteer about 2 years ago. And first thing out of the box, Bob asked me to come up with some ideas about how we can bag up these oyster shells. We're starting to pile up a whole bunch of them, and we need to figure out how we can use these things. And so, not knowing anything about oysters or anything, I came up with some wild ideas. Went over to Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who also has a similar program, and I got some really good ideas from them. Came back and built a little prototype. So instead of bagging up one bag at a time with a shovel, now we can do a dozen bags at a time using a front loader to load them up. So we reduce the amount of labor and increase the output. So it's a much more efficient process. So, that seemed to work. And so we built a second rack to double our capacity. And so now with 10 or 15 volunteers, we can crank out. We've done as many as 1,000 bags in a 2-hour period of time with the volunteers. And so now we have this way of producing a lot of bags of oyster shells that we can use for all kinds of projects all over the place.
So now you garden oysters. It's what
Yeah.
to describe for me, well, what that means, and I think I sort of sketchily talked about it. I guess they're about 2 feet by 3 feet, something like that. What are the dimensions? What goes into this thing?
Well, I think it's 2 by 4 feet. I think roughly.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
In that
Yeah.
area. Yeah, it's the same general size, but they call it a Taylor float, and the concept is that you provide a habitat for these little baby oysters. They call them spat on shell, that keeps them up off the bottom. Keeps them, away from all the muck and stuff on the bottom, and allows them to be in water that's circulating constantly, so they always have a fresh supply of nutrients floating by. And the volunteers, like me, and I think there's about 90 or 100 people.
It's 88 right now.
88 around the 3 bays that are doing the same thing. Our responsibility is to, just kind of nurture them. Basically,
Make them feel appreciated.
Take them out of the water every couple of weeks or so, once a week, and hose them down. They get a little dirty, even floating in the water. Flip them over, clean them off, put them back. Make sure they're tied securely and not getting hung up or floating off someplace where you lose them. So it's not a big parenting job, but it's amazing to watch, because every time you pull them out of the water, you notice that these little specks that are almost you almost can't tell what they are, and when
Right.
somebody showed you this is an oyster, they start to expand and they start to develop their own shell on top of the base oyster shell that they've attached themselves to. And by the time they come to pick them back up again, we've got these popcorn clusters of oysters that have grown, and they're really pretty good size. They're not, edible size after a year, but they're definitely alive and healthy, and they've expanded almost to the point where you can't get them out of the water anymore. I mean, they really get heavy. So I did that for my first season and signed up again for another season. So I have some out there right now. But it's interesting to see them develop and how that works. And
Do any of your neighbors look at you strangely there with that?
yeah, a few of them. Around here, everybody knows what everybody else is doing, and they're watching you every second out on your dock. What's he doing out there? And so, I've explained to my neighbors. One of them wants to sign up, do one if they have an opening next year. Some of them like the idea, but when I told them we're not allowed to eat these oysters, then they got a little turned off by it. But the idea is to help promote the growth of these, and then we can put them in some place where they can do a lot more good than they would if we just ate them all.
Ate them all, right?
And that's a good point there, is that oyster gardener oysters are not for human consumption. That's not why we're growing them. These are, the term I like to use is workhorse oysters. We're putting them in there to, we're enhancing their population in the bays for this filter feeding process. And our intention is to produce them and use them in other projects that help clean the bays. These are not aquaculture oysters. Aquaculture is coming to the inland bays, but that's not what this program is.
Right. Yeah.
So, and where do you put these in the bays? What kinds of areas?
In the past, we've put them in riprap and just hand placed them and things like that. In the future, our intention is to use them in reef projects, in living shoreline projects, so that it's again the program is going to be producing raw materials for our restoration projects throughout the bays. Between the oyster gardening program and the Don't Chuck Your Shucks program, that's going to be the basis for a lot of our restoration activities in the inland bays.
So how many oysters do you think you might produce a year through this?
Right now, it's not a lot. It's about 20 bushels that we produce, and the oyster gardeners only have the oysters for a year. So when we take them out and put them into our storage facility, they're not supposed to be any bigger than a quarter. So they'll be about a quarter. And they'll be stored there. So, but it's our capacity right now is about 20 bushels.
And so how time consuming is this? You described how you have to kind of like watch over them and drift them up, and is it constant monitoring? Do you see them? Do you look at them every day?
Careful, your time card's going to be.
Well, you're out on the dock all the time anyway. At least, old retired guys are out on the dock all the time. And so, I'm looking at them. I'm checking them out. I pull them out, see how they're doing, and about once a week or so, give them a bath, hose them off. It's not a big time requirement, really, to be honest with you, and it doesn't take up space that you would be using for anything else. So it's really a minimal impact on me, for the person who's doing it. And during the winter, it's even less requirement because we just suspend them, and then the things freeze over, and you can't do much for them, and they're on their own. But they're tough. They make it through. Even now, I mean, they're frozen over, but they'll come through it okay.
Yeah, I was going to say because it's been pretty cold, icing and so on and so forth. But they don't take any particular care. I mean, do you do anything extra when it gets this cold, or you just like let them hang?
At this point, there's not much you can do. It's iced over, and we turn the water off to our docks, so we can't really spray them down anyway. So they're pretty much on their own.
Now I'm not a marine biologist, but naturally, this type of process would happen. Oysters are we'll get exposed to the cold weather, when they're during the lower tides, and right now today they were blowout tides, very, very shallow. Looked like I had an email from somebody in South Bethany was telling us it looked like somebody completely drained the canals in South Bethany. So you will get some mortality because of this, but for the most part we expect them to survive, and that's when you're growing an animal like this, and that's what oysters are. For this purpose, you do have to expect some mortality.
So, in terms of the significance of the oysters, in terms of cleaning the bay and bays, have you had the same kinds of problems, do you think, in the inland bays as, say, for instance, we've seen in the Chesapeake Bay? Have you had a problem with oysters dying off or being depleted, or?
Well, right now there is no commercial fishery
right.
in the inland bays, as there is in the Chesapeake.
The bay, Chesapeake Bay.
Our problems are similar, nitrogen and phosphorus. Although in the inland bays we don't have the toxins that are afflicting some parts of the Chesapeake, but the diseases that would affect oysters were primarily dermo and MSX, have affected oysters in the inland bays in the past. Our broodstock that we use for the oysters we get from Rutgers University, it has resistance to dermo and MSX, the difference between us and the Chesapeake is a matter of scale, where it's a much larger watershed than we are. But I think we're basically the same problems.
And so as you came to Delaware from where?
From the D.C. metro area.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what made you move there and get involved with this program? And what?
The warm, sunny January.
Yeah, the tropical climate.
Right.
Well, I'd spent almost 40 years in Washington, D.C. I retired from Department of Energy, and I've always been involved in energy efficiency, renewable energy, environmentally oriented kinds of things most of my career, and I was looking for a way to kind of continue that kind of general theme. Although I'd never really done anything with oysters except eat them, and so when I found out about these guys, I thought this is a pretty good fit for me, and it has been too. It's been a couple of years now, and I've been working with these guys, and it's been a great experience. But coming from D.C. area, working there all those years, down to lower, slower Delaware, it takes a little getting used to.
Now, obviously there are a number of people who are doing the oyster gardening. Is there like a little community of sorts? Do you know each other?
Actually,
no,
no, I really haven't. Well, at some of the meetings, you bump into a few people that do it, but we don't have like an oyster garden club or something like that. Maybe that would be a good idea. Exchange ideas and bathing techniques. And
well, we do find that the town of South Bethany. Ab does not live in South Bethany, has been a big supporter of the program over the years. And we have a lot of oyster gardeners in South Bethany. Our plans are to expand the program to about 120 sites. Some of that will be in South Bethany, but we're definitely looking at going to some of the other sites. Ab mentioned his neighbor. He's probably going to be one of our sites there. So we're as we grow, we'll expand more, and yes, we will try to have more of that community, because the program is also, while it does produce the raw materials that we want, one of the center's reasons for being is the outreach, and it does give us an opportunity to reach out to waterfront homeowners, and that's an important thing for us.
So you think you're going to expand this then with more and more people participating?
Our goal is at the end of is to be at about 120 gardening sites.
Gardening sites, yeah, yeah. And then that will and how sufficient is that for the needs of what you look as in terms of the bay and the waterways? I mean, I guess you got. I mean, I guess it helps, reduce erosion and things like that. I guess when you place them in the oysters.
Yeah, yeah. For our immediate needs, it should
Yeah.
be fine. But there's going to be more oysters into the inland bays, as I mentioned before. Aquaculture is coming to the bays, slow but surely, and the more larvae that's in the water that's swimming around, the more of a natural set that you'll have, and maybe someday there. Right now, there's not a wild oyster harvest in the bays, but maybe someday there will be.
So, Ab, and in terms of you, are you going to expand your efforts there? Or are you going to be just
We got big
content
plans
to?
for him.
Does he got a plan for you?
Yeah, I'm up for anything that they want to throw at me. I think our next challenge might be figuring out how to maybe semi-automate that reef building process, the process of laying the bags out along the shoreline. It's all manual labor right now, and it's conceivable we might be able to come up with a way to make that a little bit easier and less labor intensive. And so, starting to think about some ideas on that one. But anything that we can do to help improve the quality of the water around here, I think is a good idea. Anything we can do to help oysters come back and make the bays a better place, I'm all for it. So,
By the way,
that's why
what's been the sort of? I mean, I said a bit about what reaction to your neighbors, but do you get a sense that the community that at least you live in that they're aware of what you're doing, that this whole effort?
Yeah, it's been. I haven't had any negatives. Everything,
Yeah.
it's been positive from what I've heard in my neighborhood. I think everybody's all for it. I think if more people knew, maybe, getting the word out, I guess, is the hard part. People tend to shut in and, live in their own little world sometimes. But the more we try to get the word out, the better off we are.
By the way, we're talking about don't shuck your shucks. So the restaurants, right, that participate in this.
Mm-hmm.
So what kinds of restaurants do you have that?
Well, pretty much anybody in the watershed that in the Rehoboth, Bethany, Fenwick area who sells oysters participates with us. The participation's been great. I think the restaurants do it, for the right reasons. They want to help out. They want. I think everyone. I could say without a doubt that every one of our restaurant partners feels that clean inland bays waters is not only good for business down at the beach, but it's a quality of life thing. Nobody wants to live next to a body of water that you can't fish or swim or you know what I mean on that. So we thought it was going to be a hard sell to restaurants to participate. It turns out they've been eager to participate and really have been great partners. This past year we keep a tally of what we've collected. We topped 4,000 bushels this year. 4,000 bushels of spent oysters is a lot of oyster shells.
Yeah.
They've been great. Each and every one of our partners has been great.
So, and is it take some extra time at these restaurants to sort out the shells, or?
Yes, it
Yeah.
does. And there is a bit of training that goes on with their wait staff. I think a lot of the restaurants in the Bethany area, the Delaware seashore area there, they have great wait staffs. They spend time training, and that our goal eventually is that anybody that comes to, whether they're from the DC area or who knows what parts, that if they ask, hey, you're recycling your oyster shells, what happens to them, and that they'll be able to talk about that. The restaurants are eager to participate, to be not only to be seen as the good guy that's going the extra effort, on there. But also to, again, they live in the community. They want clean water too.
So this program then is going to go on for a fairly long time, I mean, for the foreseeable future.
Oh, yeah. We started it in 2014, and every year it's climbed. There's a bit of a lag. You have to collect the oysters and let them sit for at least 6 months. It usually ends up being more like a year. And you also can't just take these bags and dump them out in the bays. Typically, they're part of a permitted project, and so we're in the process of planning some of these living shoreline projects and some reef projects. One that's going to be going on in Dewey Beach, which is a comprehensive stormwater and living shoreline project. We did one near the salt pond. It's in the salt pond, where we use the shell bags in there. So they're going to be in more and more places. I wish I could describe it better, but that the bag holds together the shells, and it has a bunch of nooks and crannies in there, and that's the refuge for not only oysters but mussels and crabs and things, juveniles that get in there and need that cover to be able to survive. So it's a great product for that.
And I understand, I think I sent you some notes, that this is obviously not just a Delaware thing, but I mean, Virginia, I guess, if Virginia folks are doing it. So, I mean, it seems like it's a growing effort here, certainly in the region.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even down into Florida, I've seen.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Doing some research, and people are doing the same thing down there.
Right. Well, when I first asked Ab to get involved in it, he went to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and they were terrific. They allowed him to come down and participate in one of their events.
Yeah. They put me to work for a day, and I learned how to do it.
Right. Yeah. And so there's collaboration between all of these groups to a certain extent, and we all know what's going on, and we go to conferences and things like that, and we share ideas. So I went to a conference in New Orleans in 2016, and there were probably 18, 20 other organizations like ours that have programs that are more or less similar than what we're doing. Not only in the Don't Chuck Your Shucks, but also in the oyster gardening.
Mm-hmm. So it's becoming sort of fairly popular in some ways, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah. Seems to be catching on. Yeah.
Are there publications, by the way, for oyster gardening? Are they? I
maybe
haven't done that yet, huh?
Not yet. Not yet.
Well, you can start one.
You could. Yeah. When you look at the pile of oyster shells we have down there, last summer I spent a couple days turning the piles over. It is just an enormous. It's mind-boggling the number of shells that we've collected. And when you look at these piles of shells, each one of them costs somebody in a restaurant $1, $1.50.
Yeah, buck a shuck.
Buck a shell. There's millions of dollars worth of oyster shells down there. So it's interesting the way that we're able to take these, which would end up in a landfill or somebody's driveway or something like that. Take them and use them for something that's really important and very useful and helps our environment. And I think it's a really great concept. Whoever came up with it to begin with.
And if people want to help,
yes,
one of the best ways to do it, go to one of our Don't Chuck Your Shucks restaurants on our webpage, which is inlandbays.org. There is a section for the Don't Chuck Your Shucks program, and our participating restaurants are in there. We'd love to have you go order up a dozen if you like oysters.
Yeah.
I happen to love oysters, and tell them you're there to support them and the Center for Inland Bays.
We were speaking with Bob Collins. He's a program manager for the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays, and Ab Ream, a volunteer with the center and is also a participant in the oyster gardening program, amongst other things. And we appreciate you both stopping by and chatting with us about this.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Frank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.